Robert Blackstone, engineer from North Nottingham, voter, has he just summed up what this election is all about?
Are you two really the best we've got to be the next Prime Minister of our great country?
We'll be seeking to answer Robert's brilliant question in the TV debate. And as you prepare to cast your vote on July the 4th, we'll be discussing whether this result is going to turn into a repeat of 1992, that shock result for John Major, or is it going to be more reminiscent of Tony Blair's landslide in 1997?
So we'll have Rishi Sunak versus Keir Starmer, the last head-to-head, and the final sprint to Election Day.
Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Camilla Tominey.
And me, Kamal Ahmed.
The question of whether it is going to be 1992, Kamal, or 1997...
Yes, shock or what is predicted.
Exactly, has kind of dominated the whole of the election campaign. And we have had poll after poll after poll predicting a landslide victory for Labour. The size of majority remains in dispute. So too is the extent of the Tory wipeout being debated by different pollsters. But that's how it seems. However, it could be a case that the pollsters might have got it wrong, and we could be surprised on the morning of July the 5th, or even, frankly, the evening of July the 4th, if we go by the exit poll. Kamal, should we remind ourselves of that moment in 1992? This was a week out from the general election. Yep. Neil Kinnock, then Labour leader, is there, believing the polls. He didn't necessarily know he would win, but he clearly gave the impression at that now infamous Sheffield rally, 10,000 comrades, as he addressed them, all gathered in the room. And there was this sense to which he was performing a bit of a victory lap, even though the race wasn't over at this point. So he's geeing up the crowd. He's announcing colleagues as if they are the next Labour government. And this is what he said to the troops.
Comrades! Well, all right. Well, all right. Well, all right. Well, all right. We better get some talking done here, serious talking.
That clip from the BBC really brings back memories. That was the first election I ever covered. I was a young journalist in Scotland, and I remember watching it with slightly between your fingers, because when you were watching it, you could understand that in the room, this was Labour for the first time since 1979. They were going to win. They thought they were going to win. And you were watching this and you had this feeling in the pit of your stomach, it's not over the line. You sound like you're taking the voter for granted. And it was in that last 10 days before the election that Kinnock went from a lead, nothing like Labour have got now, but from a lead of between 2 and 7% in the polls to being everyone thinking that Labour was going to win, to, of course, losing the election to John Major a week later. And I think that is why 1992 is worth us considering now, with Labour much, much further ahead, but still not sealed the deal.
Is talk of it being 92, not 97, rather ambitious, precisely because of the numbers you've just mentioned, Kamal? We're talking about the Labour Party, according to various polls, being 20 points ahead. And in this case, Kinnock was only up to 7 at the best estimate.
Yeah, so, I think that's right.
I mean, it's nuts, isn't it, to think that it's comparable in some respects, unless shy conservatism, which was the phenomenon that was observed back in 1992. A very young professor, Sir John Curtis, back then said the pollsters made a huge mistake. They totally underestimated the level of Tory support. Perhaps people weren't admitting, even to their nearest and dearest, that they were voting for the Blues, let alone to the pollsters. That's not quite where we are at the moment. I get that point that Ian Duncan-Smith made on the Daily Tea some weeks ago about it being a wide but shallow lead for Labour, and because you've got to factor in the undecideds. But at the same time, it's such a big gulf to get back now. Yeah,
so we'll hear from David Davis, candidate, of course, and Conservative grandee a bit later in the podcast. But you're right, 1997, the Blair landslide seems much more where we are as we did with 1992, let's just remind ourselves of the exit poll and a little bit of the tone of that time.
And as Big Ben strikes 10, the polls close, we can give you the results of our exit poll. We've spoken to 14,000 people in 200 constituencies tonight, and we hope they've been telling us the truth. There it is, 10 o'clock, and we say Tony Blair is to be Prime Minister and a landslide is likely. And reaction from Sedgefield already down there on the right in the Labour Club, all applauding there, Conservative Party headquarters, rather more sombre scenes.
And that was the Conservatives obviously out of power for 13 years. So let's see how the discussion develops over the next 20, 30 minutes. But I think we're probably more 97 than 1992. But there are some interesting twists and turns on that journey.
So funny listening to that back, because I was in my first year of university and I'd sort of witnessed at school the decline of Thatcherism, who had been very popular in my house and in my community and family. I remember vividly being at my private girls' school and I heard two teachers say, "She's gone," with great relish. And then sort of the dawn of Blairism, you'll remember more fondly than I will, really, because lots of people were filled with hope and had switched sides, and it did seem to herald the dawn of a new era. But I think those closest to me were very much in the sceptical camp.
Were they? Interesting. We've had quite a few of our readers write about this whole debate about what type of election are we facing now, landslide or shock, which I think is where we're going. Andrew Waite said, John Major went on and on about the breakup of the United Kingdom if Labour won in 1997. Project Fear didn't work then, and it will not work now. So I think Mr. Waite there picking up on, are the Conservative attacks on Labour now around tax particularly, and around the costs and the regulations of the type of government Keir Starmer might run, are they really going to be successful for people?
I mean, he's almost too bland to be scary. They're trying to do this thing that he's as scary as Corbyn because he propped him up for 4 years. People are looking at Starmer, and we're going to get onto this a bit more when we properly delve into the debate itself. They're just looking at him going, well, meh. He doesn't really inspire any strong emotions, I don't think. How about CC? I still think the result will be more like 1992 than 1997, but the result may not be definitive. Hung Parliament, minority government, the last thing we need. Shades of my whisper it. Is Rishi Sunak on the brink of a comeback there from one of our readers?
Camilla, I'm going to if that column, which has become famous,
before Farage, before D-Day,
has become famous. If on election night and when the exit poll comes out at 10 o'clock on July the 4th and when we get the results into July the 5th, if the Conservatives are anywhere near the Labour Party, I'm going to carry you in a sedan chair with alarums and cheering to say
that's how I should be brought into the office any day.
Particularly after your award. Cheering you and saying, Camilla Tominey called it right.
Yeah.
I think it's unlikely.
I think it's unlikely, to be honest. But that was an early take after the first week, and I think it's gone rather stale. Should we discuss the debate itself, Kamal? Because you were there in the spin room. The air conditioning broke down. You looked a little bit...
It was quite sweaty. I know you complained last time that my head was too big. And
no,
I think
it was just your extreme close-up.
Extreme
video
close-up.
dispatches.
Yeah. And this time it was a little sweaty, and our wonderful producer John, who was with me, was trying to. Had to do quite a tight shot because he didn't want to do my sort of slightly damp shirt, which can also look a bit
thank God you weren't in your knitwear. Can I say that from the telly, I thought that it was a comprehensive victory for Rishi Sunak. I thought that he had some fire in his belly. I love that bit where he really took on Starmer and started being a little bit Jeremy Paxman.
Cannot be returned. Well, do you know where these people come from?
No, he's not answering the question.
Do you know where
they
come from? Iran,
you can see.
Syria, Afghanistan. So when Keir Starmer says he's going to return people, is he going to sit down? Are you going to sit down with the Iranian ayatollahs? Are you going to try and do a deal with the Taliban? It's completely nonsensical what you are saying, right?
I saw someone tweeted that Rishi Sunak had found his Weetabix.
Yes,
and he's suddenly got himself.
Taken them.
Although I would say, Camilla, that I was up at the first TV debate, and actually in this environment, Rishi Sunak is very good. He is a good debater. He's good at that jab. A debate is not. Sometimes Keir Starmer can come across like he's a chess player, and you need to actually be a boxer. And Rishi Sunak is much better on that kind of territory.
Yeah, and I just thought he showed real passion, he showed energy, he showed this sort of more aggressive streak that, frankly, we should have seen from the very beginning. Let's not forget, the postal votes have already gone out. 6 million people have voted. I think around 3 to 4 million watched this debate. So whether it can win people over at the last minute, I don't know. Before you give me your view on Starmer, just let's dip into the readers again, because we polled them on the night as they were watching and said, who has impressed you most? 81% of 62,000 readers voted for Sunak. But this is interesting. Some readers seem to be U-turning on their decision to vote for reform, not just, by the way, after Farage's comments about Putin, but on the basis of what they're seeing from Rishi Sunak in the final throes of this election. So David Berry, I've voted Conservative for 40 years. I'm from a working class background. I considered reform, but seeing Starmer tonight, I'm going to vote Conservative. There's no way this bloke should be running the country. Rishi has my vote. He did well. Voting reform is a wasted vote, to be honest. And then Edna Clouds added, I have to say I was a full...
Edna Clouds?
Oh. Edna Clouds. Oh.
Boom, boom.
Could be a Tory stooge, but let's just hear what she, he, they have to say. I have to say I was a full-bore reform before this evening. It seems that pressure is making a real impact on the Tories. Rishi Sunak was impressive tonight. He's finally sounding like a true blue. He's thrashed Keir Starmer on every single issue. Is that right, Kamal?
Isn't it interesting? This is the 1992 thread, isn't it? This is the idea that people are only starting to focus, of course, as you say, in 1992, postal votes weren't such a big deal as they are now, so people voting early. But even so, the polls only really tightened in John Major's favour in the run-in, the last 7 to 10 days, which is where we are now when we're recording this podcast. If you look at the polling which goes beyond the Telegraph, YouGov called it 50-50. I mean, we know that Keir Starmer, genuinely needs to walk onto the stage, not drop his trousers, not sort of throw up and broadly get off the stage without sort of saying he's a supporter of Adolf Hitler. And broadly, he will probably be okay. I think you're right that Rishi Sunak had a good debate. Keir Starmer was much better in the first half. I described it when I was there at the TV debate in Nottingham. I said it was almost like England grinding out the 1-0 over Serbia in the Euros. Quite good for 25 minutes, then dropped deeper and deeper, became slow, a bit ponderous, but still got the victory in the end. And I think from Keir Starmer's side and from the Labour side, that is how it will be seen.
Kamal, I love the fact that you bumped into Darren Jones after we featured Gordon Rayner's exclusive on the Daily Tea yesterday, where basically he revealed this secret recording of Jones admitting that the net zero plans will cost billions and billions. When you said, it's me, Kamal, from the Telegraph, did he sort of give you an evil stare, or was he okay?
To give him his credit, yes, I spoke to him yesterday at some length, sort of slightly more privately as well, about how the campaign was going. And no, he was completely straightforward. He had a pretty straightforward answer to the story that we did break yesterday.
Let's be clear about what this is about. This is about private sector investment in companies owned by the private sector. Energy companies, grids, energy infrastructure across the country. And to get to net zero by 2050, which was what I was talking about in my coffee morning in my constituency, then yes, of course, we expect the private sector to be able to invest that level of funding. There is some need for public subsidy for certain technologies, and we've set out that in our manifesto, and it's a much smaller number. But all I was talking about was the route to net zero and the role the private sector has to play, and that's based on independent evidence from the Committee on Climate Change and everybody else that looks at these issues on a cross-party basis.
And you think it is hundreds of billions of pounds can be found over the next decade and a half or 2 decades to get this country to net zero? Hundreds of billions of pounds. Do you think voters are going to believe that?
Well, it's what the private sector is telling us. I mean, if you are trying to build nuclear power stations, if you're trying to build the hydrogen economy, if you're trying to build out grid and distribution networks, if you're trying to help people who want to insulate their homes to do so, this will be lots of business for the private sector. They want to invest in the capacity for their businesses to invest in the UK, but they're not doing so right now because of failures from the Conservatives on policy and the economy.
I think Mr. Jones making a good fist of a defence there about the numbers, but I think the voters still will worry about the bills attached. For Keir Starmer, as I say, he's got to keep it simple. You always see when he speaks now the contours of the campaign. And the contours of the campaign, and this, I think a lot of this is based around what Labour's focus groups are telling them, what voters are telling them, why aren't they voting Tory? And that is always around chaos and the whiff of not playing by the rules. So in the first answer he gave, which was actually about gambling, Keir Starmer very quickly moved on to wrap in Partygate. He got there very quickly. It's this idea that we've got to keep reminding the voters why they switched away from the Conservatives to try and stop the drift that you've pointed out, Camilla, that some people are thinking, actually, maybe the Conservatives are the right answer. Always mentioning Liz Truss. He shoehorned Liz Truss into as many answers because of this idea that Labour want to land with voters, economic chaos. Remember Liz Truss. But
didn't quite work that way.
He actually came a little bit unstuck there because, of course, there is a rather large elephant in the room when it comes to previous leaders that may have been supported by people for Keir Starmer. And Mishal Hussain pointed that out, I thought, rather neatly.
The Prime Minister said he warned the country about Liz Truss and the damage that she was going to do to our economy. And then in the next breath, he said we must unite behind her and support her. Why on earth would you unite behind someone that you say was going to do that damage?
You know what it's like to fall in behind a leader of your party.
But he's repeating the problem.
Michelle is saying that mentioning, of course, Jeremy Corbyn, who Keir Starmer only a matter of years ago said was going to be the perfect leader to lead the United Kingdom.
Indeed. What do you think a good result is actually going to look like on the night for the Tories? Because we've had a second MRP poll sort of repeating really what the Telegraph poll with Savanta found last week, that the Tories will be decimated. Our poll put them down to 53 seats. This poll is putting them to 60. But interestingly, it finds that the Liberal Democrats will shoot up to 71, making Sir Ed Davey the leader of the opposition, and it puts Reform on 18, which we're going to discuss a bit later. We could have a really weird situation here, Kamal, and we've discussed this before in terms of vote share and the seats that you get in return, that talk of a supermajority. It was pointed out in the leaders' meeting earlier that actually Keir Starmer could end up winning fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn in 2017, but at the same time have vastly more seats.
Absolutely. This question about if the Labour share that gives him a huge majority is anywhere below 40% of those who voted on possibly a low turnout, that's a real problem for Labour, as we've said. I think there are going to be quite a large number of rather sweaty chief executives of polling companies at 10 o'clock on July the 4th, hoping that their wipeout narrative is actually how the UK public have voted in this election. And again, that ties us back to 1992, because 1992 famously became the one that the polling companies got wrong. And these complex, what are called regressional polling analysis, which doesn't just use the answers that people give you, but do things like propensity to vote, for example, is higher amongst older people in comparison with younger people, is higher amongst people of higher economic income levels than lower economic income levels. And they put this into a quite complicated process and then come out with these regressional polls, which have given these huge leads for Labour. What would look good for the Conservatives now, oddly, is something that would be as disastrous as 1997, but at least the Prime Minister hasn't lost his seat.
Yeah,
and that is really odd.
Not more disastrous. I mean, at the moment, if they end up with 3 figures in terms of seats, that's a good night.
Rishi Sunak will say, I've done really well, which is unbelievable because, of course, Camilla, if we'd been looking at this a year ago, or when Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, if he'd been saying to the public then, if I get 150 seats, I'll be delighted, we would have ridiculed him. Yeah. So it does show how much we've travelled. One thing I did notice last night, I spoke to cabinet ministers, I spoke to candidates. The Conservatives have dropped, and I think this is right, all discussion about we know we've lost, but don't give Labour a supermajority. And I actually think that's right. I always thought that was a very bizarre strategy to put in place, because all those undecideds are thinking, well, why would I bother voting for you if you've lost already? So I caught up with Daily Tea favourite David Davis, the former Brexit secretary, obviously fighting for his seat in Halton Price and Howden in Yorkshire. I think he's got a majority of around about 30,000. I expected maybe he'd be a little bit negative.
50% of the public basically haven't made up their mind. Most of those instinctively Tory people, their options will be go for us, go for reform, go for Labour, or don't vote. All except going for us gives them a pretty grim tax future. So I think, yes, it's a longer shot now than it was when we first talked, but it's certainly still possible, and I think tonight made it more probable. And whatever you do, don't ask me to make a bet on it.
I hope. And now, Mr. Davis, have you made any bets on elections, past or present?
Yes, I have. Not on elections, on political events. I bet on the Brexit referendum on the day of the Brexit referendum. And the reason I did that was everybody, you may remember, everyone's saying, oh, Remain have won. Even Nigel Farage, in a conversation I had with him 2 minutes after the polls closed, said Remain have won. So I was so cross, I put money on Brexit succeeding. I only got 3-1, but it allowed me to say at every interview that evening, I'm so sure we're going to win, I'll put money on it.
Do you think we should change the rules on whether politicians can bet on political events?
No, not really. I mean, look, I don't care very much. If the House of Commons wants to make a regulation, fine. It's not going to change some critical fundamental freedom. But you're answering the wrong question, really. The question you've got to answer is, did people misuse privileged information? If you're an insider trader, it's a criminal event for that reason. And the same sort of guideline ought to apply here, but it already does. That's what the Gambling Commission is investigating. So if the House wants to make that rule, it's fine by me, but I wouldn't press for that. That's not the answer to the problem.
Going to win your seat?
Oh, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. See you soon.
Bye-bye now.
Well, coming up next, we're going to be discussing reform and, of course, the star of the show, or at least the real star of that BBC TV debate, Robert Blackstone, the engineer that became the Brenda from Bristol of the election campaign.
Welcome back. So one thing, Camilla, that is very different from 1992 and 1997 is reform. In 1992 and in 1997, there was no attack from what might be described as a hard right. You'd have to go right back to 1983 when an insurgent party almost tipped over one of the incumbents, and that's the SDP almost getting more votes than Labour did. Obviously, the SDP then from a centrist position, Labour from a left position, they almost completely upset the left order at 1983, but didn't quite make it, and that was their high watermark. Of course, Reform have got the same issue for the Conservatives in this election, which is much more like 1983 than either 1992 or 1997. And as you said, could, according to some of these polls, win as many as 18 seats. And I put that to, yesterday again in the spin room, I put that to Victoria Atkins, who is the Health Secretary.
Well, I think we've had more than 100 polls just over the course of this election campaign. They all have wildly different results, and so we are completely focused on polling day. That's the only poll that matters. And again, the choice is clear. We cannot surrender our tax policy, our borders, our NHS to the Labour Party, and a vote for anyone other than the Conservatives will help Labour and help bolster Keir Starmer. And as we've seen tonight, he doesn't have a plan, and he does not know what he's going to do when he gets into number 10. A lot of romantic phrases, but no actual action. And when he was put under pressure, it was really interesting. When he was put under pressure, he began to crumble, and I think the public will have seen that tonight.
My feeling, Kamal, is that Reform may have peaked. They may have had a post-D-Day peak, and now they're coming down slightly. The idea they're going to have a vote share beginning with a 2, I think, might be overstating the case, and it'll actually begin with a 1. I mean, it'll be in the high teens, but it's not quite as Nigel Farage is billing right now.
Let's get into the wonderful Robert Blackstone, because he actually, Camilla, I think supports a lot of your sense around what people are thinking about reform. When you're at these types of events, and Camilla, you and I have done many election campaigns, there's often a moment It's like you say with Brenda from Bristol. Brenda from Bristol famously, in the 2017 election, when Theresa May called a surprise election, said, "Oh no, not another one."
In a similar vein, Robert Blackstone sums up the mood of the nation by asking these two candidates as they're grandstanding on the national debate stage, is this really the best that Britain can do? Which absolutely just cuts through any political ego at all and gets to the heart of the matter. And the nub of this election, Kamal, I think, is so much negativity around all of the candidates. I'm fed up with the Tories. They've let me down, so I don't want to support them. I do think that Labour might be even worse, and I can't pin down Starmer on anything because he keeps on changing his mind every 5 minutes. They're not going to be very good, but I feel like I'm forced to vote for them. And by the way, we've got Nigel Farage here on Clacton Pier, banging drums. And although I quite like the idea of reform just as a protest vote, something doesn't sit well with me with Farage, and I don't want to support him either. That's the kind of Sophie's choice facing the electorate. They're basically being asked, do you want to be stabbed or shot? Which would you prefer? Because at the end of the day, you might just end up bleeding out with any of these candidates.
Camilla, that's so sad, yes. But I think that means that we're not feeling it's a 1997 election, because, as you say, there was a mood that it was time for a change, and actually Blair was that change. So I spoke to Robert Blackstone. He came into the spin room, and lifelong Conservative voter, and this is what he said.
In the past, I've always voted Conservative.
And what do you think you'll do this time?
I really don't know. That is an honest answer. I am very, very undecided.
Do you think, could you imagine for the first time in your life, given where the Conservatives are at the moment in terms of what they've done for the last 14 years, that in the first time in your life you could consider voting Labour?
Probably not.
Because?
Because the Labour Party appears to have an undeclared agenda. They've mentioned nothing about inheritance tax, which is important to me, because not so much because I'll be gone, but it'll be for my sons. Yes? They've talked very little about council banding, and they've talked very, very little about fuel duty. And those things affect me directly. And I could do with some real answers to those before I put my cross on the ballot box.
I just want to give a shout out to Mr. Blackstone. It shows that people are being really thoughtful.
Yes.
He had really thought about all the
Absolutely.
options in front of him. And I think sometimes we don't realise how much people do think about the choice that they have to make on July the 4th.
What do you think is going to happen? Do you think it's going to be 92 or 97?
I think horribly, you're going to hate this is my mushy middle, as you sometimes describe. I think it's a mixture of both. I don't think the Conservatives are going to do as badly as some of the polls are suggesting. I think the polls will tighten over the next few days, but it is certainly not a 1997 moment. And that, if Keir Starmer does win under that scenario, which I think is the most likely, that is going to be Keir Starmer's biggest problem. Huge majority, but he hasn't taken the country with him.
I'm still
and Camilla,
thinking,
which way are you leaning?
Whisper it, Kamal. But I think it is going to be.
You have to pause it, didn't you, Camilla? Because you don't want to. We could whisper. Should we literally whisper it? No, let's not do that. No.
Now, Kamal, whisper it. But I have changed my mind since that column of May, the whatever, because I think he's had his good moments on this campaign.
Rishi Sunak,
but I just think people have stopped listening. So even when he has good moments like the TV debate, it's too little too late. And therefore, if he'd done all this at the very beginning, when he came into the Daily Tea studio, if he'd kept up the momentum and not made all of those subsequent gaffes, he may well be in a very different position right now. With a week to go, he is going to have to pull off an absolute miracle to avoid what I think is going to be a Tory-geddon. I think it is going to be a repeat of 1997, but not with the joy and jubilation. I think it's going to be a Labour victory by default, rather than indicative of some enormous swing to this new left-wing promised land offered by Keir Starmer.